DEI programs are hypocritical and a grift for power couched in the guise of moral superiority. Why did you say this?
I said it because it's true.
My next guest was 18 years inside the universities, teaching, mentoring, watching how institutions work from the inside. She has a PhD in psychology from UC San Diego, and she could have stayed in her lane, but she wrote to do something different. She wrote a lot of papers and she started writing and speaking about something most academics hardly venture into. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she has some very strong opinions about it. The movement that swept through universities and corporations over the last decade and a half in the US. And she's not just very effective, she's actually quite powerful in that segment. She debated this at the Monk Debates in Canada, one of the most prestigious debate forums in the world, and won. 83% of the audience voted with her. She has to be convincing. In addition to working as an assistant professor, she also coaches individuals and organizations on how to cut through the noise and actually start performing in life. Please welcome Dr. Rebekah Wanic. Rebecca, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be on your podcast.
Yeah, I think it was a long time coming. I'm glad we were able to work out some dates between us. So I'm just gonna go jump in on to segment one, Rebecca. So you are a psychologist by training. How do you end up writing about institutional politics instead of, say, cognition, behavioral therapy, and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm a social psychologist by training, so I'm not a clinician. I was never interested in doing directly therapy. And my background was with gender and power in relationships, and then also factors that affect motivation. And one of the things that I started teaching was psychology of gender. And I noticed over time that the real world had shifted, but what was being taught had not. And I noticed a lot of sort of false narratives being repeated over and over in ways that to me seemed damaging to not only students, but also to organizational functionality. And for better or worse, my dad might say for better, but other people might say for worse. I just was born with the need to speak out. If I see something that I feel passionately about, I feel like I need to speak out about it, but not without educating myself first. So I had noticed things directly that were occurring in my own interactions with individuals, and then sort of seeing what was happening within the larger higher education. And then, like you mentioned, extending out into business. And there were these ideas that sounded great on paper, like diversity is our strength, that people felt really uncomfortable challenging because they felt like they didn't have the moral authority to do it. Because part of what we'll probably get to this later, but part of what the DEI agenda is about is usurping moral authority. And so when people feel like if I speak out against this, I might be perceived to be a bad person, that really creates a culture of canceling thought. And I've always felt really strongly about finding my moral path. And so if it doesn't align with the larger narrative, I feel comfortable speaking out about it. So it's more kind of, I got into higher ed because I really wanted to help students. And a lot of what I see, I think, doesn't actually help students. And so that's really the reason why I started to publish pieces.
Very fascinating. I think there are at least three, four subtopics that I can ask based on what you said. But I think what I'm very curious about is a couple of things. One is you said you want to teach people gender and power dynamics and relationships, and you also mentioned that there were a lot of false narratives that were being said, which means probably as an academic you just thought it was being injustice done to the students. At what stage did you decide that it was done? Like, how did you find out that these false narratives were going on, and what were these false narratives at a high level?
So, just to give you a very concrete example, everyone gets taught that we live in a patriarchy, that women are disadvantaged, that women have the second shift. And while that was true, probably up to the 80s, it's not true now. So, in the United States, for example, we have had preference programs for women and minorities since the 1960s, the civil rights era. So, that is, going on over 60 years of programs that are specifically designed to be anti patriarchy, anti-white in nature. So you can't sit there and say that disparities in achievement are the result of these systemic disadvantages when we actually have systemic advantages for the groups that you're claiming are being harmed. And what I noticed in particular in the gender dynamic is that this is starting to be, and lots of other people have spoken out about this, it's starting to be a problem in cultivating interpersonal relationships, particularly heterosexual romantic relationships. Because you have this thing where women are like, I'm not going to do anything to, be beneath my partner in a relationship. But to be in a relationship, you both sort of at times need to subordinate yourself to the other person's interests and needs. So that's just one sort of concrete example where I've seen it. And then it plays out in higher education as well. We've had preference programs for women and minorities in higher education programs. So at some point, if you see disparities in outcome, you might want to look and say, perhaps it's something about personal choice. And there are other factors at play. I'm not saying it's only about personal choice, but when I was teaching the psychology of gender class, a lot of times students at the end of the semester would say, what I really appreciate about this class is as a woman, you made it feel okay if I decided I want to be a stay-at-home mom. Whereas every other thing that I've ever heard is that that's selling myself short or I need to be more. So when I say diversity is hypocritical, it's not about diversity. It's about you need to want the things that we in the diversity metric space tell you need to want. And I think that's damaging for students when they're trying to figure out their own goals and desires.
Yeah. What I'm quite curious about is, why did you think that this is very important and these narratives were damaging to people? Is it that you feel humanity is not being best served, that this relationship between male and female is going in a direction that it shouldn't be?
I think it's that humanity is not being best served by the narratives that are pushing people away from what they may want. So the thing about diversity should be a recognition that different people want different things. However, it can't ignore the reality that men and women come into the world with a different set of genetic predispositions. And though not sort of making choices that help you fulfill some of those things that are inherent in being born as a man or a woman can potentially be problematic. And again, I'm not saying every man and every woman is born with exactly the same set of predispositions, but for example, why are there continuing to be more men in the innovation space, entrepreneurs, leadership roles? Because men are oriented more towards competition and gaining status. Women are oriented more towards cooperation. This is just an inherent difference that on average is higher in men than it is in women. So if you're sitting there telling women, you need to lead, you need to lead, you need to lead, but it goes against their natural inclinations, they might end up feeling uncomfortable. They might be less successful. And if you feel uncomfortable and you're less successful, that makes you feel bad on a psychological level. So I want to live in a world where people are free to sort of pursue the things that they find to be valuable, whatever that is. There can be women in leadership. There can be men doing things that we more traditionally associate with women, but it shouldn't be like it's always about this push to get women to do the things that are going to give them power and money. So it's not really about being true to your values. It's about usurping authority in public space.
Makes sense. So you want people to play to their strengths rather than being pushed into something that they are not naturally programmed for. So one of the arguments against this, Rebecca, what I've generally seen is that these are societal constructs. That is what women generally argue, or let's say the in this case we are talking about gender dynamics. A lot of women say, "Oh, this is just patriarchy. This is just we were not exposed to these things. We were not given the opportunity to perform at a high level. We are not in the boardroom, for example, right?" Since you're a student of psychology and a professor, can you just give us some information if this is purely a societal construct, or is it in some form evolutionary or DNA or anything related to the, let's say, how we evolved?
So I think pretty much everything is a combination of both. Even if something is a societal construct, it doesn't mean it's bad. We people need sort of rules to help them navigate and negotiate both private and public space. Number one. Number two is I would recommend. So Stephen Stewart Williams has this new book coming out about evolutionary impact on human behavior, and he talks a lot about sex related differences. A lot of the differences are inherently different due to different factors across the course of history that influence the genetic predispositions of men and women. And again, we're talking about averages, so that doesn't mean that there aren't some women that are very competitive and some men that are very cooperative, but on average, there are group-based differences. There's a lot of research that demonstrates that in cultures that are more egalitarian, there are bigger differences in the direction that people try to claim are social constructs. So the evidence
Okay.
for the social construct argument doesn't really hold up when you actually collect data from the real world.
Got it. I
So
think
would a
this
concrete example help, or did that make sense?
yeah, no, that makes sense because
Okay, perfect.
I think we need to probably get into some examples of that. So if you can give a specific example of how this egalitarian societies, when they try to make it same, how did it become more different? That would be useful for the audience too.
Yeah, sure. So this, I think, is a pretty easy, concrete example to understand. So people will say, women are interested in men with money because they've historically been disadvantaged in having money of their own, and therefore it's a social teach society teaches women that they can't get on their own, so they need to get it from men. In more egalitarian countries, you tend to see that women report a higher preference for men with earning status relative to women in less egalitarian countries. And so the argument there is that, like, when you have more freedom, then your natural inclinations are more likely to be able to come out because they're less constrained by society. So if you see sort of more gender disparities on some characteristics in those more egalitarian societies, that's suggesting that socialization is not the thing that's driving them.
Wow. So it's like you intend to do something, but it drives the gap even further. That's how it
Right.
works. And
Yeah, exactly. Because again, we were talking about earlier about, freedom of choice. So the more freedom that you have, the more likely you are to be able to see what the sort of inherent natural inclinations are, because you can make whatever choice you want. In a society that is very constrained, then society is dictating a lot more of that. So the social construct argument predicts that in gender egalitarian societies, men and women should be more similar in terms of goals, preferences, etc. But on a lot of the metrics for which we have data, the evidence suggests the opposite.
okay, that's quite fascinating. So if I have to understand this, let's say now, what I have understood based on reading US data is I think more than 50 to 53 percentage of US college goers are women now. I think more than 50% is what the trend
Correct.
has been increasing in the last decade or so, right? And I also see that they are more homeowners compared to the men in the US. That even that trend is changing, and they're I think at par are probably earning a little more than men of the same age now. In this situation, now that they have kind of gotten what they were dependent on the men for, why do you think they still expect a man to be still at least up and across in terms of social status and hierarchy? Why is it that they can't probably go a little down like what men were used to? Like, why is that not changing at all?
Evolution. Evolution has oriented women towards a partner who will provide resources for them. Right, and so I'm not saying that this couldn't potentially change. Let's say women out earn men for, hundreds of thousands of years. Preferences might change over time, but right now we're operating with some inherent preferences where it's like men are driven to be competitive and gain status. Women are oriented towards seeking out those men in particular that have done that. So one of the things I always tell people is, like, you need to read a book on evolutionary psychology, and or take a class, because once you do, a lot of the stuff that people are fighting over, it makes perfect sense. And no one is saying that because that is something that we've evolved to be oriented towards, that's the only way that it has to be. But my argument is that ignoring evolution causes you to make bad policy decisions, and oftentimes it encourages you to encourage other people to do things that might not necessarily be rewarding for them.
Got it. I think it's going to take a lot of time. So I think I've read a little bit of what David Buss has written. I don't know if you have gone through it, but at
Yeah.
UT Austin, he's written some wonderful pieces on gender differences and mostly on mating and how people prefer
Mhm.
people from the other sex. Let's get into more interesting stuff. In the monk debate with your opponent Dia Khanna, you
Mhm.
described in your own words DA programs as both in practice and ideology. TEI programs are hypocritical and the grift for power couched in the guise of moral superiority. Now, that's a very strong statement coming from anyone, and I'm sure it would have pissed a lot of people. Why did you say this?
I said it because it's true. So, diversity means you want to have a lot of different types of people, not just in terms of identity categories, but in terms of the way that they think about, the way that they approach issues. The diversity programs are all about get rid of white men, get rid of conservatives, get rid of anybody that doesn't fit with our particular narrative. So it's not about diversity at all. Equity is 100% a damaging mindset because equity is about giving people equal outcomes. So it's basically very communist in nature, where it's like it doesn't matter how skilled you are, how much you put in, everybody should get the same thing at the end. So instead of promoting better outcomes, what it does is it promotes worse outcomes because the high performers are handicapped by the need to make the low performers on par with them. And then the inclusivity piece, it's absolutely not inclusive. Cancel culture at universities coincides quite directly with the push towards these DEI initiatives. And I just wrote recently in a piece for Minding the Campus about this, that higher education is increasingly full of female administrators. And one of the things that we know about female only spaces is that they tend to, much more so than men run spaces, promote cancel culture because they want ideological conformity. So it's
So
absolutely
then, if they do that, it just plays against the inclusive part that they initially intended to, right?
correct. Yeah,
If they don't want different
it's not
voices, and
inclusive at all. I could tell you about many meetings that I've been in where I can't say what I actually think because I risk everybody in the meeting, one, not liking me and talking about me behind my back.
so you mentioned that there was a narrative, right? Somebody's narrative. Now, who's this somebody who's pushing this agenda on the narrative?
So that's a great question, actually. The narrative that I'm speaking of is sort of been created by multiple entities over the course of many years. So a lot of the sort of damaging ideologies that are perpetuated through the media and higher education were jointly created by the media and higher education. I don't think you could trace it back to like any one specific individual. But it's like, that women are oppressed, minorities are oppressed. Every disparity in outcome is the result of some kind of misogyny or racism, rather than focusing on, is it potentially differences in things like the desire to do this or that particular task, the training that somebody has put effort into achieving for themselves. So Thomas Sowell very, very famously said that you don't get equal outcomes for kids in the same family. So how would we ever
Mm.
expect, to have equal outcomes for different people differentially situated across society? And I think we lose our ability to actually address issues that are problematic when we ignore what might actually be causing them and focus on things that are not really part of the equation. And again, I'm not saying that there wasn't misogyny and racism in the past and that there aren't specific racist or misogynistic people in the present. But to argue that there's currently systemic racism against minorities, particularly in the United States, is absolutely ridiculous because we've had, like I mentioned before, since the 1960s, preference programs.
Okay, so that's an argument that you are putting in now from in defense of people. Let's say somebody like Dia Khanna or the proponents of DEI. They would argue that okay, there were historically less, let's say, women in universities or less women becoming lawyers or doctors and other places. Now, I mean, they could say that oh, this is a great thing. We want diversity in terms of thoughts and career aspirations as well. What's wrong with, let's say, some of the minorities coming in and with their own agendas, or women getting some preferences or quotas or reservations and joining? What will go wrong if that continues?
Oh, I don't have any problem with I'm actually for real diversity, which means like I think that everybody should have space to speak. But when you're in a meeting and you're told you can't talk because you're white or you can't talk because you're a man, that's not about diversity. So it's like if certain types of people are expected to listen to the ideas and preferences of other types of people, then you have to give everybody the same opportunity. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. And that's why I say it's a grift for power couched as moral superiority, because people are like, oh, I was put upon, therefore I deserve this, and you deserve nothing. But again, not to keep quoting Thomas Sowell, but he's like, we've reached the state where people who did nothing are responsible for what their ancestors did in the past, and people who are actively doing things now are not responsible for their bad actions. And that just doesn't create a functional society.
I think that's true, Rebecca. I mean, I've seen this pattern play out in a lot of countries, including my own. I don't think that people love to play the victimhood for some reason. I still haven't figured out why. I mean, you could probably throw more light on that, but this is something that I've seen. Oh, we are women. We were never given a chance to do this. Oh, you're a man, so you have your life easy. In some sense, I know that it happened in the past. I'm not saying no, but I think it's just the same gramophone playing continuously the same musics. But anyway, that's what people like Dia Khanna would play, and I think you still won over her pretty easily. So great. I think one of the let's address some core issues with DA in the next section. I think this is very important. You said it was not very clear how it came into play because it was pushed by media and some higher institutions at some stage since 1960s. But you also said it kind of there was a new kind of non-diversity that DA produced against what it was supposed to be intended for. That, in your own words, you said it has reduced the diversity of perspectives allowed in the classrooms. I know you just mentioned about having similarity of thoughts in some form with women, but just walk me through this paradox. Why did DI produce a new kind of non-diversity?
Yeah, again, because it's hypocritical. It's not actually about diversity. It's about removing a certain set of voices, particularly white, particularly male, particularly conservative. So, lots of studies have been coming out showing the ideological leaning of faculty on campuses, and they're very, very left, with like a significant proportion identifying as extreme left. So then faculty start to control who gets hired, and they won't hire somebody that doesn't have that same ideology. And I'm not sure about the universities in India, but many universities in the United States have also done things like remove classic works from the canon, like Aristotle, Plato, and because these are classicist white males. And so the idea is that instead of bringing in new perspectives and adding, it's about bringing in new perspectives and subtracting the old ones. And I'm not saying that there isn't ever a space for sort of replacement, but the idea is that higher education should be about exploring ideas, challenging yourself. And so a lot of what's getting removed is kind of like these core ideas from some of the classical writers stick around because they speak to something about humanity. So you're basically deciding that these are not things that are appropriate for anybody to be reading anymore, not because they lack merit, but because of who produce them. So that I think is a problem. And then secondarily, you can see this in many, many hiring searches. They will say, we are only going to hire a woman, or we are only going to hire a minority, or we are only going to hire a minority woman, for example. So again, if you're going based off of identity, you have now not looked for diversity. And people always argue, well, I think you had brought it up, that people might say, well, don't we need to redress something that's happened in the past? And the idea is we're at the overcorrection point right now. There was just a study that came out that showed, contrary to the popular narrative, that women are actually at an advantage for getting hired in higher education. So, people say we need to hire more women because women are not in higher ed. BS, right? They're there now. So it's like, you, as an activist, you're never done, because the activist gets, a lot out of fighting for something, but they're fighting to correct a problem that doesn't exist anymore, and creating a new problem in the process.
Got it. There seems to be a sense of fear among people. Is that true? Let's say in US universities, people can't actually speak their mind like what you and I are doing right now. And if
Oh,
more people are not, how does it play out? Like when you see each other and like, hey, can I say this? When you meet your, let's say, fellow professors and colleagues, or maybe along with students, do they actually worry that I feel like saying this, but I can't because I'm going to be reprimanded for saying that? Is that there's a layer or a culture of fear that's being spread?
Oh, absolutely. Surveys show that students report censoring, excuse me, and faculty report self-censoring at very high levels. And I know, I tend to be like, I'm just kind of a silly person. So in class, I start off the semester by letting students know, my job is to challenge you to think outside of the box. So if I don't say something at some point that makes you feel a little bit offended, it's not my intention to offend you, but we're going to talk about some things that might be a little bit challenging. Come talk to me about it. And so I'm lucky because I get a lot of students who do come in and have conversations with me, but I hear them, they're kind of like low voice telling me about the censorship that's taking place in other classes. And I know for a fact that there are people that have told me, like, maybe you shouldn't speak out so much. Aren't you worried about getting fired? And I oftentimes will be very careful about who, when, and where I will introduce certain types of ideas because there definitely is the potential for it to hurt you. It can hurt you socially and it can also hurt you in terms of your career. And the same is true for students. They don't want to be ostracized and have no friends on campus. But again, the problem is if nobody feels comfortable speaking up, we don't really have a good sense of how the group actually feels. So we're operating as if everybody has this same, mono mindset, when in reality, there actually are diverse voices there that are just not given space to speak.
Got it. So give me one specific instance if it happened. I mean, let's say you had some students in the class who believed in the DEI and let's say the patriarchal or let's say misogynistic mindset that's been perpetrated around. And they came to your class, maybe a few sessions, they were against what you were saying. Has there been an instance of people coming and telling you, you know what, Dr. Rebecca, I thought it was different, but now I understand how it works?
Yeah, that happens a lot, especially because when I teach the psychology of gender course, we end the semester doing debates. And I tell the students, I'm just going to assign you to one side of the debate. So it doesn't really matter what you actually think. Your job for the purpose of the class is to argue the position you've been assigned to the best of your ability. So then that requires them to really dig into like, what are the arguments in favor of this perspective? And one of the debates that is on the agenda now is society more biased against women or more biased against men? And again, the narrative is that women are the ones that are experiencing more discrimination, but when the side presents all of the evidence that demonstrates that it might actually be men, students don't necessarily just change their mind, but I have them write reflections and they say, I never thought about these things. I never encountered these things. And even though I still might have my position, this has given me a new way of looking at the issue that is useful moving forward. So, contrary to a lot of my colleagues, I am not trying to indoctrinate my students. They can have whatever opinion they want to have. And there are different ways of interpreting different pieces of evidence. My job as an educator is to expose them to different ideas, and in particular, to challenge them to look at things from a novel perspective. So, feedback like that from my students, particularly after doing the debates, is really validating because it makes me feel like I'm doing what I'm doing. I know from what students tell me that in other classes that is not the case. If you do not say what the professor wants you to say, you'll get marked down on your assignments.
Wow. I think you're doing the right thing. Fantastic, Dr. Rebecca. I think the way you're telling people to, I think you're just making them think that's far more important than the right answer or wrong. But I think what's more interesting is some other colleagues of yours who are rating them badly for saying something that they shouldn't be, which even though it turns out to be right, that's number one. What I'm even more worried about is, let's say, your colleagues and professors who are supposed to teach them the right thing, but they don't. That's even more damaging for the students who are going to learn something from them. Is that really happening in colleges now?
Yes, it's definitely happening. Also, kind of related to the equity inclusion piece of the DEI, there's also a significant reduction in standards and expectations in college, which is equally damaging. So the helping them to sort of like think about things, critically evaluate evidence, recognize when different pieces of evidence might be missing, that's a huge part of higher education. But the other piece of it is learning to push yourself. And so part of the inclusivity thing is that everybody needs to, feel good about themselves and get good grades. So then you really have a hard time enforcing standards. And so I, as somebody who believes in standards, believes that like if you don't push yourself to meet the standard, you're not going to grow. get oftentimes a lot of complaints and pushback from students because things are too hard. And well, I could turn in assignments late in this other class. Why is there a deadline? And it's like, because the world operates on deadlines, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's like you're an adult. You could make whatever choice you want to make. I'm just trying to help you understand that for every choice there is a consequence. And the consequence for me for speaking out and being the way that I am is that my life is harder, but I feel like it's worth it because I think that these are ideas that need to be expressed, especially within the higher education space.
Absolutely, Dr. Rebecca. I think if you have to speak the facts according to you or say the truth, it's still going to offend somebody. So somebody still has to do that. I think one of the arguments that I've seen pro DI, I just want to get your perspective on this. I'm just going to read this out. There was this point that without deliberate intervention, hiring panels and admissions committees just replicate who they already look like, or some existing bias never gets addressed. As a student of psychology, you know this very well, right? So people tend to like people who look like them, or familiarity plays a huge role. How do you address this point that people pro DEI make? What do you make of it?
Well, I think that again they're being hypocrites because they're absolutely correct. But now what we've done is just flipped it. So the only people that are getting hired now are people that fit with the diversity agenda. So in the past, I do think there was need for a concerted effort to sort of address some of the issues that historically were plaguing equal access. Now, like I said before, we've had so many years of programming designed to address those gaps that we need to start looking at other pieces. So what I always think is like look at merit. Is this person, so let's say for hiring a professor, would they come in, did they give an interesting job talk? Are they a competent public speaker? Have they taught classes successfully in the past? Those are the things that you should be looking at, their actual merit. And sometimes it might matter who that particular person is, but usually that should not be the primary issue. And again, we mentioned that there is evidence that many hiring decisions in higher education were earmarked specifically for a particular type of candidate, not based on merit. And the reason why that bothers me is because I know a lot of times people look at me and they say, oh, a woman in higher ed, she must have gotten her job because she's a woman. And I feel like
Ah,
I work damn hard to get where I am. So the fact that these preference programs exist, it actually works to undermine the respect and authority that's given to people that fall into those diversity enhancement categories.
Dr. Rebecca, is this is this getting applied only at a student admission level, or is it also happening at a hiring level for professors and associates at a college, the teaching role also?
So you mean the preferences for like women or
The
minority candidates?
Yeah,
It
the
it's
diversities and
it's happening everywhere, not just in higher education, it's happening in industry. So the data showed post 2020 that like the least likely person to get hired across a wide range of different categories was a white man in America. So you cannot sit there and say that we live in a patriarchy that supports white people when they're the least likely to get hired in the post George Floyd era. So the and all of the admissions data, that we just had. Well, actually, I don't know if you know, but in the U.S., we just had a recent Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court basically ruled against universities in these preference programs that they were giving to minority students because a highly qualified white or Asian applicant was not getting in over a highly underqualified minority can and people talk about how Asians are the minority of convenience. So they
yeah.
oftentimes but so my point is just it's happening everywhere. It's happening in hiring outside of higher ed, it's happening in hiring within higher ed, and it's happening in who is getting into certain types of schools for both undergraduate and graduate programming.
So I'm just curious, what wrong did a white male in America do? I mean, I feel bad for him when you say this.
Say the first part again?
what wrong did a white male do in America? I feel bad for the situation that
What
they're
did he do?
facing now.
He existed.
Yeah.
In the current DEI climate, he existed as a white male. So supposedly he has privilege by virtue of that identity category, but the evidence suggests that now that's not correct. And I just saw some data from Australia that showed that women were out earning men. So again, is there patriarchy? Yes or no? And someone was just sharing with me. I didn't have a chance to verify this data, but someone was sharing with me that in the United States, young women are more likely to own homes now than young men are, like
Yeah.
Gen Zers. So again, it's like the evidence is suggesting that the world is not the way that the advocates within higher education, the social justice warriors, are claiming that the world actually is anymore.
That's true. I think the data is pretty clear in the US that women are in fact out earning men, and they're probably doing much better, right from college to schools to in corporate jobs and in terms of owning homes as well. I think the data is pretty clear. I think roughly about 53, 54 percentage to, and it's just going in the direction. So I'm just curious to understand this part about, I mean, you called this thing about inclusive excellence, the term that people created in colleges at some stage, which you written about in one of the beautiful articles, a rebranding of DEI universities, a participation trophy. You just called it that. Like, what's the actual damage when you lower the bar in the name of inclusion? Because it's been happening for a long time. What's the downside to it?
So people work to the standard that they're given. So if I lower the standard and I say just by showing up, you get an award, some people will just show up. So I think that it is best to work in a situation that incentivizes doing a good job. The other person that it hurts is the person who actually is the high performer. If we keep rewarding low performers at the expense of high performers, the high performer is going to leave or they're going to check out, neither of which is beneficial on an individual or a corporate or higher education level. I want to work with colleagues who are smart and push me to be better. I don't want to work with colleagues where I feel like I'm better than all of them, because that then what is your sort of driving force? People will excel when they have standards and when they're put in a position of competition. But the idea is we need to feel good at every single second, because feeling bad, and one of the things that might make you feel bad is somebody outperforms you. That's something that we're trying to eliminate. And that's bad because it stunts personal growth, it stunts organizational development, and ultimately it hurts society, because we're not pushing people to be these creative entrepreneurial geniuses that they otherwise could be, because we're rewarding all of the low performers for just showing up.
I think one of the other arguments I've seen, Dr. Rebecca, is that these underrepresented groups, whether it could be gender or minority or certain ethnicity or race, their argument was that we were not given enough chance for long enough duration for us to have, let's say, or show equal output or show equal outcome. Do you think there is a merit in that argument at some stage, or was there any merit in that?
Yes, I think there used to be merit in that argument. But again, 60 years of preference programs is many people had the opportunity to take advantage of those programs, and many people have. Kind of like we were just talking about. You see that women in particular were taking advantage of these programs and are now working to outperform men. In different types of settings, you see different distributions that have changed over time as a result of some of these preference programs. I don't have a problem with preference programs in the past. I have a problem with DEI as it's instantiated now, because not just of what it's doing with the specific people that are around, but more what it's doing with the ideas that can be discussed, how they can be discussed, and how it's actively undermining not only personal well being, but societal well being as well.
So let's say if you were given the responsibility in University of California, San Diego to redo the DEI program as it stands today or any other university, how would you do it?